On the morning of the 23rd of May, 1944, near the Italian village of Carano, an American platoon was ordered to do the thing it had been dreading: get up out of its holes and attack a line of German positions dug into high ground. And to do it, they would first have to cross a minefield swept by German machine gun fire. Most of the men looked at that ground and saw a death trap. One of them looked at it and saw a job. His name was Technical Sergeant Van Barfoot, and he had spent days crawling around that no man's land on patrol until he had the whole deadly maze of it mapped in his head. So when the attack began, Barfoot did not just go through the minefield. He went through it alone, out along the German flank, straight at the guns that were supposed to stop everyone. Think about it from the German side of that line. They held the high ground, they were well dug in, and they had covered the one obvious approach, the minefield, with machine guns, exactly as doctrine said they should. Any American attack across that open, mined ground should have been shredded. What the German gunners were watching for was a wave of men they could cut down in the wire. What they got instead was something they were not looking for at all. A single American soldier, working his way along their flank, low and patient and alone, coming at their positions one at a time from the side. By the time the first machine gun crew understood that the threat wasn't out in front of them in the minefield, but right on top of them, it was already too late. Barfoot reached the first German machine gun nest by crawling right up to the edge of it, close enough to throw. Then he put a single hand grenade directly into the position, a direct hit that killed 2 of the German crew and wounded 3, and silenced the gun. 1 nest down, but he did not fall back to his own lines to report it. He got up and kept moving, working his way along the German defensive line toward the next gun. This was the pattern of the whole morning. Barfoot alone on the enemy's own flank, going from position to position down a line that was supposed to be impenetrable, taking the German strongpoints apart one by one, and the men who had built that line to stop an army were about to find out what one determined man could do to it. At the second machine gun emplacement, Barfoot came in close again, and this time he used his Tommy gun, the Thompson submachine gun, killing 2 of the crew and capturing 3 more, who put up their hands rather than die at their post. 2 nests now, cleared by 1 man. And then something remarkable happened at the third position. The crew of the next German machine gun, having seen what had come down their line, did not even wait to fight. They abandoned their gun and surrendered to Sergeant Barfoot on the spot. One American, moving alone along their flank, had so thoroughly unhinged that stretch of the German line that its defenders were giving themselves up to him. But Barfoot was not finished collecting Germans, not by a long way. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like, and stay with us all the way to the end. Leaving the prisoners he had already taken for his support squad to gather up, Barfoot kept going, mopping up the German positions in the immediate area and taking still more prisoners as he went. When the count was finally made of what 1 man had done on that flank in a single morning, it was almost hard to believe. Van Barfoot had, single-handedly, captured 17 German soldiers, on top of the machine gun crews he had killed or driven off. 17 prisoners, taken by 1 man moving alone down a fortified enemy line. It is the kind of number that belongs to a whole platoon on a good day, not to a single sergeant with a grenade, a Tommy gun, and a map in his head. And crucially, it opened the door. The German strongpoint that had been blocking his platoon's advance was broken, and the way forward was clear. That should have been a full day's worth of heroism for any soldier, enough for a lifetime of stories. But the war on the 23rd of May was not done with Van Barfoot, and neither was he done with it. After the assault, he reorganized his men and consolidated the ground he had just taken, digging in on the captured German positions, and it was then, as they were catching their breath, that they saw them coming, German tanks. The enemy was launching a fierce, armored counterattack, and it was aimed directly at Barfoot's platoon, at the very ground he had just paid so much to take. 3 German tanks grinding forward toward a handful of infantrymen who had nothing that could stop armor. As Barfoot himself later put it, 3 people and a rocket launcher was all we had. What he did about the tanks is the part that turns a great soldier into a legend. Barfoot knew his few men and 1 bazooka were no match for 3 tanks in a straight fight, so he ordered his people back into a ditch, out of danger, and then he took the rocket launcher himself and walked out to an exposed position directly in front of the 3 advancing German tanks, alone. He waited, out in the open, with a single-shot weapon, letting the lead tank come on until it was about 75 yards away. Then he fired. His first shot struck the tracks of the leading tank and blew them apart, stopping it dead and effectively knocking it out of the fight. The two tanks behind it, suddenly facing a hidden gunner who had just crippled their lead vehicle with one shot, lost their nerve for the direct approach and turned away toward the flank. And Barfoot was still not finished. As the crew of the disabled tank climbed out of their crippled machine, he engaged them, and then, rather than pull back to safety, he pushed onward into enemy ground and found a German artillery piece that had been abandoned, and he destroyed it with a demolition charge placed in the breach, so it could never be turned on his men. Only then, with the counterattack broken and the enemy gun wrecked, did he finally start back toward his own platoon. And even that walk back was not empty-handed. Along the way, under fire, Van Barfoot stopped to help two of his own seriously wounded men and brought them back to safety with him. One man, one day. It is almost too much for a single story to hold, which is exactly why it earned the highest award the country has. But to understand it, we have to ask who Van Barfoot even was. If the ordinary men behind these extraordinary days are why you're here, subscribe. Keeping their names alive is exactly what this channel is for, and Van Barfoot's beginnings were about as ordinary and as American as they come. He was born in 1919 in Edinburgh, Mississippi, one of 9 children in a farm family, and he carried Native American heritage, Choctaw, through his mother's side, a lineage he quietly took pride in his whole life. There was no money and no easy path. He got as far as about the 8th grade in school and then went to work full-time on the family farm because that was what was needed. He was, in short, a poor Mississippi farm boy with an 8th grade education and no obvious future beyond hard work, one of the millions of such young men across America whose lives were about to be swept up completely by a war on the other side of the world. Van Barfoot did not wait for the war to come to him. He enlisted in the United States Army in 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, before America was even in the war, and by the time the fighting started he was already a soldier. He ended up in the 157th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbird Division, a hard-fighting outfit that would see some of the toughest campaigns in the European theatre, and Barfoot saw them from the start. He took part in the invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, then the landings on the Italian mainland at Salerno, and then, in January of 1944, the amphibious assault at Anzio, a beachhead that turned into months of brutal, grinding stalemate, with the Germans holding the high ground and the Americans pinned below. By May of 1944, Barfoot's unit had been sitting in that deadlock near Carano for weeks. Anzio was one of the hardest places to be a soldier in the entire war. The Allied landing there in early 1944 had been meant to break the Italian deadlock by leaping behind the German lines, but instead of a swift breakout the beachhead had bogged down into a months-long siege, with German artillery zeroed in on almost every foot of the cramped Allied position and the front lines frozen. For weeks and weeks, men like Barfoot had lived in holes in the ground under near-constant fire, unable to advance. So when the order finally came in May of 1944 to break out, to get up and attack the German lines and end the stalemate, it was both a relief and a terror. It meant leaving the holes they had survived in for months and crossing open, mined, machine-gun-covered ground. It was into that long-awaited, dreaded breakout that Van Barfoot walked, alone, on the 23rd of May. So hold the whole picture now. A poor Choctaw farm boy from Mississippi with an 8th grade education, who enlisted before the war even started, survived Sicily and Salerno and months in the hell of the Anzio beachhead, and then, on the first day of the breakout, took an entire stretch of the German line apart by himself. Knowing where he came from makes what he did clearer, not smaller. Nothing about that farm in Edinburgh promised the Medal of Honor. What it had given him was patience, toughness, and a refusal to be beaten by hard ground. The exact qualities that let one man map a minefield, walk a fortified flank alone, capture 17 of the enemy, and then stand in front of 3 tanks with a rocket launcher. And what the army did to recognize that single, staggering day, and the way Barfoot chose to receive it, is the fitting end of the story. What Van Barfoot did near Carano on the 23rd of May 1944 was recognized with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. But the way he chose to receive it says as much about the man as the deeds. By the time the medal was approved, months later, Barfoot's division had fought its way out of Italy and up into France. He was given the chance to travel back for a grand ceremony, and he turned it down. Instead, at his own request, Van Barfoot was presented the Medal of Honor in a simple field ceremony, out in France near Épinal on the 28th of September, 1944, specifically so that the soldiers he served with, the men who had been there, could attend. He did not want the medal handed to him on a distant stage. He wanted it given to him in the field, among the men who had earned their own share of that day. And Van Barfoot's story did not end with that medal or even with that war. He had earned a battlefield commission, promoted from sergeant to lieutenant, and he stayed in the army and stayed and stayed. His career would ultimately span 34 years and 3 wars, World War II, then Korea, then Vietnam. Along the way he added a Silver Star, a Bronze Star, the Legion of Merit, and 3 Purple Hearts to the Medal of Honor, and he rose all the way to the rank of colonel before he finally retired. The 8th grade farm boy from Edinburgh, Mississippi, spent his life as a soldier and became one of the most decorated and respected men ever to wear the uniform and, in the words of more than one historian, one of the most significant Native American heroes of the Second World War. Colonel Van Thomas Barfoot of Edinburgh, Mississippi, of the 157th Infantry, 45th Thunderbird Division, the Choctaw farm boy who walked alone through a minefield and down a fortified German flank, knocked out 3 machine gun nests, captured 17 of the enemy single-handedly, stood in front of 3 tanks with a rocket launcher and stopped them, destroyed an enemy gun, and carried 2 of his wounded men to safety, all in a single day, received the Medal of Honor in a field, among his men, exactly as he wanted. And there is a fitting coda. Decades later, as an old man, Barfoot had to fight one more small battle with a neighborhood association that wanted him to take down the flagpole and American flag in his own front yard. The old soldier refused, and the nation took his side, and the flag stayed up. Of course it did. There is a thread that runs from that minefield near Carano all the way to that flagpole 65 years later, and it is worth naming. Van Barfoot was a man who simply would not accept that a thing which needed doing was impossible. A minefield covered by machine guns was not a reason to stop. It was a problem to be solved by crawling it at night until he knew every inch. 3 tanks against a handful of men was not a reason to run. It was a reason to pick up the one weapon they had and go meet them. He did not do these things because he was fearless. No sane man in front of 3 tanks is fearless. He did them because he had decided, long before, that being afraid was not the same as being stopped. That is the quiet, stubborn courage that a farm can teach as surely as a battlefield. Most people have never heard the name Van Barfoot, and most have never heard how one man broke a German line and stopped a tank attack in a single day near Anzio, which is exactly why places like this comment section matter. If your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather fought at Anzio, or in Italy, or served with the 45th Division, or came home from any war and rarely spoke of what he'd done, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them, one thing they did, or said, or that you remember. The men who crossed that impossible ground for the rest of us deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them, and there always will be.